Okay, welcome to the virtual seminar series. This is the last one of fall 2014. We have Matt Miziorko, the GIS specialist for the Center of Health and Homeland Security, speaking today. He'll be talking about integrating GIS, or Geographic Information System technology, into a comprehensive emergency management program. He's on contract at Montgomery County, Maryland Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security, where he supports programs relating to public alerting, GIS, flood mitigation, and assisting in the EOC. Matt received both his undergraduate in geography in 2009 and his graduate in emergency management, this program, in 2011 from Millersville University. So without further ado, here is Matt.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and it's a pleasure to be back at my alma mater here, helping to kind of pass some of the information that I have learned along to those of you in the MSCM program. And I would like to make one change. This just happened a few days ago. I actually was promoted to a county employee at Montgomery County, Maryland, doing the same thing. I just changed from the Center for Health and Homeland Security to county employee. So as we move on, as Jeff said, I am very proud alumni of Millersville University. I currently work for Montgomery County Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. Previously, though, I was with the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security, and just prior to that, I worked for Carroll County, Maryland's Department of Public Safety as an overall emergency management specialist. But that's not why I'm here today. My job today is to talk about GIS and introduce what it is. We're going to talk and kind of elaborate on some of the components of what makes a GIS, really focus on the importance and why every emergency management program should be leveraging this kind of technology. I'm going to put into some very basic context, too, for everyone to understand. And we'll wrap it up with some GIS in action, which is always a good thing. I have a little case study from when I first started here down in Montgomery County that we'll be talking about. So let's get started. What exactly is a GIS? And as Jeff said, it stands for, it's an acronym for Geographic Information System. And it's very important that you pay attention to the last word. It really is a system. It's not something standalone. This is made up of really 5 key components: people, software, hardware, data, and procedures. And all of them play an equally important role. But at the end of the day, it's all about the people. You hear about that in your classes as you go through sociology, principles of emergency management, as you apply these things for whether it's fire rescue or Department of Transportation. It all comes down to the people. And who are the people? They are analysts who sit down and analyze different parts of data or systems or consumer needs. They are specialists, those with a very defined role, such as database management or cybersecurity or cartography or field surveys. They're also data managers being from your county's Department of Technology Services, or if you work for a consulting firm in the private sector, your IT support staff, those who make sure that the computers, the GPS software, the servers, the network is always up and ready to go with as much redundancy as possible so that you are always able to perform your task. And lately, within about the past 5 to 10 years, the programmers have really come in, especially now that we're using what's known as open source solutions, or solutions rather that have no or very little cost associated with them. And that is a very big asset for faith-based and nonprofit partners such as the Red Cross or Catholic Charity Relief Services or Doctors Without Borders that want to be able to use geographic information to further their cause. And of course, it also comes down to the consumers, the people that we work for, those who use our GIS data on a daily basis. If you're in a non-emergency management function, It could be something as simple as a UPS driver using a GPS unit for turn-by-turn directions to deliver your Christmas presents, or it could be an incident meteorologist who is using data on fire load, wildland fire behavior, or the FEMA or the National Guard for search and rescue after a large flood. Ultimately, these are the people who use our information. Software, of course, though, is very, very important. Without software, we would be back in the days of paper maps and hand-drawn cartography. And it's really broken down into two areas. There's something called COTS, which is commercial off-the-shelf software. Three really big examples of this are ESRI, ArcGIS, which most of you have heard about if you're a geography major or if you've worked with any kind of GIS or relatively familiar with it. It's your software that you use to assemble data, manage data, really across multiple forms. There's also, if you're in the private sector, for disaster management or anything relating to crisis management technology, you've heard of Blue Marble software, which is also used for data conversion, cloud storage, and taking data from one coordinate system to another. And finally, there's a lot of other commercial software out there, but rounding out what I would consider to be the big three is Parasolid, which is used a lot for surveying and hazard mitigation projects for processing images, satellite, aerial images, LiDAR technology, and laser technology, which is something that we'll touch on a little bit later in the talk. But as I said, with budgets being tight, given recent trends in the public sector and overall nonprofits side of things, freeware is a really big boon and a really big asset to the GIS field and emergency management as well. And two of the big freeware softwares that are out there is one called GRASS, which stands for the Geographic Resources Analysis Support System, and Quantum GIS, also known as QGIS or QGIS. The Department of Energy and also the Park Service leverage Quantum GIS on a regular basis, and I actually use it on the side and have found it to be a pretty solid piece of software. Like I said, too, there's also hardware, things that work alongside with us. Earlier, I kind of alluded to the server side of things, which is where your data is stored, your license keys. It's where information is processed on a very large macro scale. And then if we move down to where you're actually leveraging or analyzing or programming, you will find yourself on the desktop or the laptop side. Each in their own right has their advantages. Desktop computers have larger computing power, which is great if you're looking for really large data sets for county, state, federal businesses. If you're in the private sector and you're doing disaster mitigation as a consulting firm and you have large, and your client is a very large geographical area, that helps you out. But the downside to that is a desktop is very clunky. It takes up a lot of space. You can't carry your desktop to you. And if you are working for COOP, which is continuity of operations, and your site becomes uninhabitable, that desktop cannot come with you, whereas a laptop can. The trade-off is it's not as powerful as a desktop, and you do have to carry your power cable around with you or have a wireless internet. But laptops and cell phones and tablets are really becoming the wave of the future. And of course, we can't forget printers. Most people think of the standard HP or Ricoh printers that are 8.5 by 11s, which are great for little plans and very small areas. But it really comes down with us. We look at some of these big plotter printers that can print maps up to 34 by 44 inches or even larger for when you're looking at very big detail that needs to be illustrated to a lot of people. And of course, I've also talked about this new trend here, BYOD. It's bring your own device. You're seeing it now if you have a child in school where iPads, Samsung Galaxies, and cell phones are becoming more and more powerful and more versatile with each release. So it only makes sense that the industry is leveraging these for things like damage assessment or accessing maps on the back end, doing some very basic editing and management of servers. It's definitely a trend that we'll see evolve and continue to become more powerful as people want to become more and more mobile. And another thing that we look for in a hardware stance is when we're looking to try to collect data. What you see here is a graphic of a piece of field equipment. It's called total station, and if you use it for surveying for electrical lines or coastal environments, if you're doing hazard mitigation, accident recreation after a large accident or hazardous material spill, this field equipment allows you to take data, capture it with a very high accuracy in real time, and then bring it back to your work or your desk location so you can go and continue to refine it. But ultimately, it comes down to the kind of data that we have. And there's really two kinds of data. The first is vector data. And what I mean by that is points, lines, and polygons. A couple examples of point data that you would work on, or I work on a daily basis, are fire hydrants for fire protection coverage and access for the fire department when they're actually working on an active incident, street addresses for damage assessment, route mapping, or to understand where trends in some kind of development are going from a residential standpoint or commercial or industrial. Line segments are also very powerful. There's roads for evacuation mapping. There's hiking trails if you're doing search and rescue. We have a very large water body that runs near our county, the Potomac River, so having access to hiking trail data helps us if we're looking for a lost hiker or have to access the river at certain locations. And of course, there's also polygon data, and this is very important because you can really start to leverage the intertwining of how society is shaped. For example, if you're taking roads and street addresses next to a river or an earthen dam, you want to see where do they lie next to the 100-year floodplain. So we can begin to overlay points and lines and polygons together to say, well, you've got so many addresses, there's so many businesses that are at risk for flooding on a 1 in 100-year chance. You may need to add this to your hazard mitigation plan. Or if you have municipality data, municipal boundaries, you can ask for how many square acres of your municipality or your county are at risk from flooding. And vector data comes in what's called a shapefile. I'll provide a couple examples of that and just explain what a shapefile is momentarily. But one of the cool, one of the cool data files that we work with a lot too is called raster data, and it's really multi-layer data, satellite information. For those of you who may be meteorology majors and you're used to working with the different bands of satellite imagery from the Terra satellites or the geostationary or polar orbiting satellites, the GOES or POES, you use that a lot as well. The National Guard and the military use a lot of satellite data for what's called in situ analysis. If you have a battle going on in a different part of the world and you need to monitor that area remotely, satellite data is key for intelligence gathering. And also for after Hurricane Katrina, we use satellite data to map how much of the city of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast were underwater. And of course, there's LiDAR data, which is using lasers to sound elevation from remote sensing pieces such as planes or helicopters. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. And as I said, we compare vector and raster data. It's kind of hard to understand if I just put points on or bullet points on a PowerPoint. So I'm going to give you this example here. Think of vector data as a very discrete representation. If you look here on the right column of pictures, you see these little cells, and they are individual points. Vector data is used to try to make things very finite and discrete, whereas raster is modifying reality to make things appear visual. And you can see that you sacrifice resolution sometimes in order to get the point across or to do some very macro level analysis. But at the same time, you can also really, if you don't mind having a larger data set to work with, you can get very, very fine, granular analysis using certain kinds of raster data points. And you may say to yourself, well, what exactly is a shapefile, Matt? You said a term that we're really not all that familiar with. And it's really a data file that's exclusive to the GIS community. You don't use it if you're at Microsoft Outlook or if you're working on an Excel spreadsheet, but it's comprised of several pieces of information. It's a data table. So if you're working with street addresses, you'll have a data table of the road name, the address point, whether it's on the right or left side of the street, how long the address point has been in the county records. Has this address been around for 10, 20, 50 years? Whether it's an apartment, whether it's a place of business, whether it's a fire station, a government entity, things like that. There's also projection information, and that's very important because you have to project information not based off latitude and longitude or some other kind of coordinate system if you want to understand where it is on the Earth. There's some other things that are in there, a style format that helps you understand what kind of style information, meaning that if this is a point or a line or polygon, what kind of symbology will this be associated with? What kind of symbol will I be using to visualize this piece of data? And you're saying, Matt, that's really nice, but we need to start tying this together. What kind of procedures are we using to make sure that this is being done in the best and most cost-effective and efficient way? And that's a great question, and this is how we really do it. We acquired the procedure for working in GIS is, with some modification, really going through this. You acquire data where you create data. It's your source data that you use. The graphic on the right shows a top kind of a topographic base layer with your parcels and your floodplains and your wetlands, your soil information, your land cover. You then store that information on a central server or a hard drive or a geodatabase. And that allows you to be a central repository where you can edit information, you can query information, such as if I want to see how many houses or parcels are within a floodplain or on a wetland, and then you can visualize it. You can display it in a process called cartography where it looks pleasing and it's able to tell a story very easily. And then you present this map, you present this geographic story, and to the consumer, it feeds an overall process, and then you are able to identify and archive information for future use to show historical trends, which from an emergency management perspective is very important from the mitigation side and the preparedness side. It helps us to learn what kind of risk is in the community and how we can better to reduce that risk to the residents of our area. And you say, well, there's a lot of different kinds of data. How can we capture this data? Well, if you're looking really far back in history, so say back to the 1950s or even back into the 18 and 1700s, if you have one of these older cities, say New York City, that's really changed a lot over the past 200 years, you can look at hard copy maps and try to digitize that. It's a good way to not only preserve older data, but it's also a better way to help visualize and transform it into an easier to digest process. There's also coordinate systems, latitude, longitude, state plane coordinates, which are used kind of at the state level. And if you're looking for large search and rescue areas, you can use a process called UTM coordinates, which I won't go into for this discussion. That's a little more involved than what we could cover here. There's also, like I said, digital data, global positioning satellite data, GPS, which a lot of people use if you're going to a vacation or if you're going to go and use route analysis. And I talked about this earlier, LiDAR data, which stands for light detection and ranging. It's a process similar to Doppler radar where you have a laser emitted from a source, whether it's a plane or a helicopter. It's shown down on the Earth or your study area, and based on the length of time it takes to go from the emitter to the object and back, you can tell things like elevation, what way the Earth is pointing, what kind of surface it's looking at, whether it's a hard blacktop, whether it's mud, wet sand, a tree, a power line, and that's very important because it helps us to catalog things for future use. And one of the areas that this is really used for is in the coastal environment, and that's very important because because from a hazard mitigation and climate change perspective, 50% of the U.S. population lives within 50 miles of the coastline. So it's very important from an economic, sociological standpoint and transportation standpoint that we understand what the coastal environment is doing, because that affects everything from intercontinental trade to day-to-day public safety. And there's other things that we can look at too, such as computer animated design, which is CAD data. Some of you who are first responders may also hear of CAD. We can also ingest computer-aided dispatch or 911 data as a feed or a service into some of our GIS data real time. And a lot of people say, well, I use this GPS unit. It's in my car. I don't really know kind of what it does other than it takes me to the beach, or it takes me home, or to my job interview. But it's very important that you understand what it is, because GPS really has not been around for all that long. It was developed by the Defense Department, the U.S. DoD, in 1973 as a means to overcome some of the other geographical survey limitations. And as you see on the right here, GPS is huge. Just from the U.S. standpoint, there's 24 satellites orbiting the U.S., I shouldn't say the U.S., but the globe, all the time at 20,000 kilometers up. So it's pretty high up, but it serves a very key purpose, not just for emergency management, but for surveying for roads or oil pipelines, search and rescue with the U.S. Coast Guard. You can use this to transmit and coordinate where the ship may be in distress or a hiker may be lost in, say, in Alaska or in the Pacific Northwest, using personal there's little devices on ships and people that will use. You can press a button and it will send a distress beacon up. We can use that to triangulate your signal very quickly. Intercontinental trade and passenger movement on planes and boats for navigation. Damage assessment is huge. GPS satellites help with survey equipment in the field to see really where tornadoes have gone or flooding. Mining uses this all the time to track equipment. And of course, recreation. It's not just bad stuff that GPS is used for. If you'd like to go out and geocache or go and find little hidden treasures that are used out by clubs, or if you want to go and for sport fishing out in deep water, or you can use that as well. And that's really, this is all about what GIS can do for you. GIS allows you to answer questions, make informed decisions, archive information, share knowledge, and really important, this is for the grant side of things, save money and time. You got to remember the golden rule. If you can, he who helps to make grant decisions more effective, or if you're in the private sector and can help to show the business impact to things, that will make your position all that much stronger as you go through for a business deal, or if you want to secure a emergency project through a UASI or a county budget process. And that really helps to enhance emergency management. And you said by now, Matt, that's great. You've showed some really cool things from a conceptual standpoint, but let's see some GIS in action. Now, like I said, from grant compliance, from a finance standpoint, that's very important. What I mean by that is if you're going to do training, say canine training on a certain part of your county, you need to do what's called an EHP, an environmental hazards application process. You can go with GIS data and say, okay, you're going to be at this address, say 1600 Main Street. Based off the data, we can give you a satellite image to show you a location to show, yes, this training is actually, this place exists. Grant funds are being allocated as they should be. We can collaborate to show it's not on the floodplain. There's no risk to flooding there if you were to train there. It's not near a wetland, so you wouldn't disturb any ecologically sensitive areas. And it's not near a historical property, so if you were going to do, say, an active shooter training with flashbangs or any kind of field equipment, you don't risk losing any kind of historical structures within your community. An executive branch of the emergency management realm, sometimes county executive or county council or the Congress may want you to do special projects, so you can help out in the executive realm as well. And from an operations standpoint, if you're working with public warning, if you need to say, hey, there's a hazardous material spill, I need to show every address point that's within a half mile of George Street or North Duke Street, we can go and use that GIS data then to send a message to those addresses that you need to shelter in place or go to this nearby shelter and get out of the way. Emergency operations, like really what public warning goes into. And of course, for a planning standpoint for hazard mitigation or the emergency operations plan or your dam plans for emergency flooding, it helps you to track changes and anticipate needs that you may not think of until the event actually happens. And also from technology, GIS readily integrates with other applications. Some of you may have heard of what's called WebBOC. It's a crisis management technology that uses tracks resource requests, school closings, hospital surges. That's very nice to see on a text data, but it's great to also visualize spatially where these things are. And of course, training and exercise. For those of you who go through HCEP, you learn about drills, tabletops, functional and full-scale exercises. GIS helps you through all those by providing site plans and puts text data into a geographical context. So you said, Matt, that's great. Let's look at some images. I want to see what this stuff can do in action. And I'll start from a planning standpoint. This is an example of LiDAR data. When there's a subdivision just northwest of Phoenix that wanted to be built, and they said, well, this is great, but we looked back in some of our historical documents and found that at one time northwest of Phoenix, during World War II, they actually used this land for target practice, but we don't know if this is really the area that you're going to be developing on this supposed bomb range. So the state of Arizona went and flew some data in coordination with the city of Phoenix because it was close enough that they wanted to go and see if there's any risk to the city. And sure enough, using LiDAR data, we were able to get terrain information. We were able to scrape off the trees and the brush and the rocks, and we were able to find a couple images here. And lo and behold, you can see pretty obviously there was a bomb target at one time. So that actually called out the military to sweep the area for old ordnance that may or may not have been exploded, because if you start digging like water lines, utility lines, or bringing children and families into the area, it's not good business to have be discovering bombs in your backyard on the 4th of July barbecue that you have. And certainly from a public safety standpoint, it's absolutely the wrong thing to do. So this helps to mitigate and reduce the risk to life, reduce the risk to property, as well as first responders that may have to respond to some kind of event like this had we not known that this bomb target was in fact there. Another image, and you're looking at this and you're saying, wow, a lot of lines here. What am I looking at, Matt? Just from an overall standpoint, you're looking at a couple things here. The gray background, once again, is GIS data. Not GIS data, rather it's LiDAR data. You're looking at the terrain, the valley for a river valley, and everything here in your blue is the riverbed itself. And that's great to know, but we need to understand what the floodplains are like. What are the floodplains? How does it hurt or potentially harm this little town that you see at the bottom center of the map in these orange lines? Well, you can see that by overlaying the 100-year floodplain in blue with the dark blue line and the 500-year floodplain in the yellow line, you'll notice that the town and the railroad line, which is in the bottom area of the map, really aren't at risk from flooding. So when you go through your hazard mitigation plan or your emergency operations plan, you're able to show with some amount of decisiveness that flooding to this town, although being very close to the river, actually isn't that big a deal. And we can say why, because if you look at the LiDAR data, it's tucked back enough away from the river in certain locations, and it's also elevated. Now with that in mind, of course, there is a bridge that goes across the river, and that's always to be at risk for some kind of flooding, or maybe impacted or closed temporarily should debris get swept at the supports. But it's to illustrate that the town as a whole, the risk is not terribly great. And unfortunately, there are times when GIS is used for a little more of a grim standpoint. And what you're looking at here is several pieces of GIS data. This is Lower Manhattan after that very sad day on 9/11 when the towers came down. What we're able to do with the help of local emergency managers are able to do with the help of, during large events with the federal government, are to fly point satellites over Lower Manhattan and take specialized real-time satellite imagery and then fly specialized planes that can collect LiDAR and heat data. We're able to stitch all that information together and to show how drastically an area has changed. That you see this huge area that has been affected by a very dastardly terrorist attack, and then look at infrared data. And what you're seeing here is all the damage and debris from the towers when they fell. But everything in red is an area that is still actively burning or is on fire or has met a certain temperature threshold that, if disturbed, could catch on fire. So, as you go and plan for what resources you need for body recovery or for debris management, you can go in here with appropriate fire equipment, the appropriate personal protective equipment, and protect your first responders during the response and recovery efforts. And that is really where, from a life safety standpoint, GIS can really save your people. And we've had regional incidents, not just in D.C., but also down in the Washington, D.C. area. And this is really the area that I support. 9/11, unfortunately, did affect the Washington, D.C. area with the Pentagon. But there's a lot of other regional incidents that we have to work on. And that's very important because what happens in the NCR, the National Capital Region, it affects a lot of people. It's two states in the District of Columbia, Maryland, as well as Northern Virginia. But it's over a large geographic area, over 5,564 square miles. But the people are really what you got to watch out for, because we have such a diverse group of 5.8 million people, ranging from the very rich, those with functional needs, the heart of the national government is here. We have Camp David. We also have several major airports in Reagan and Dulles. So GIS is very important to help us understand how this region changes, and really will continue to change over the next decade or so. And of the NCR, Montgomery County is a very big player. We're actually 500 square miles at 19 municipalities and over 1 million people, with over 5,000 lane miles of road. That's very important to understand, because Montgomery County, I'll just back up one slide here to give you that example. Montgomery County is one of the main evacuation counties for the National Capital Region. If anything were to happen in D.C., it's well known that you'll be coming up the interstates up Montgomery County, up into Frederick County eventually, and dispersing into Pennsylvania. So it's very important for us to understand where our roads are, for Montgomery County to work with the district in Frederick County, Loudoun, Fairfax, and Prince George's, Prince William, Arlington, Charles, and Alexandria, to understand where people will move as well as resources will move during a very large regional incident. And I'll give you an example of this regional incident that we had one day. For those of you who are meteorology majors, you may remember this, but this was back in June 13th of 2012. The Storm Prediction Center had issued a very big 2-day outlook that was calling for a moderate risk of severe weather, for large hail, winds, and tornadoes. And we recognized that threat here, both for across the Mid-Atlantic, and Montgomery County had stepped up our Emergency Operations Center to kind of prepare for that response. Well, we did get some damage in the afternoon, and we were obtaining data. We got some requests from our emergency support functions, or ESFs, for fire rescue and sheltering, to see, okay, what kind of damage is going on in your county as these storms move through. In this case, we need a location of damage. So we took our 911 CAD data, pushed it into what's called a RSS feed, or a really simple syndicate, transformed it from one technology into a GIS service, and then pushed it into a shapefile with a projection, a style. It was point data. It was very important that we had it easily accessible. We are fortunate enough that, as I said earlier, we have that commercial software, ESRI, or ArcGIS version 10.1, so we were able to take attributes of our damaged houses, the addresses, the cities, what kind of municipalities were affected, the location, and then transform this, query, extract the relevant data, incorporate other information such as location for fire departments, or what area the county was really getting affected, were there any schools involved, things like that. And we were able to present our findings. And within 2 hours, our GIS information was able to tell us that we had about a 17-mile path of damage that stretched across a pretty sizable portion of our county. we were considering, based off the nature of the damage, it was probably a low-end tornado, but there were 21 structures that were damaged, and this fed our damage assessment process. So the next day, we went out with the National Weather Service, and this is one of the couple pictures that I wanted to present to you guys. We were working with the Red Cross to go out and say, okay, where these homes were damaged, were they uninhabitable, did people need sheltering, how much cost would this involve, were the homes completely destroyed? If they were destroyed, was this an insured loss, which could be covered by your homeowner's insurance, or was this an uninsured loss, which would maybe count towards a federal or a state, or some kind of local disaster declaration? And of course, some of the damage was pretty significant. This is, you can see here, a house in the Rockville area. This actually had a tree come right down through the roof line. As you look on the window and the door here, it says that this home was rendered completely uninhabitable. Fortunately, they did have homeowners insurance, but these were pretty sizable trees that had come down. And this was not, this is only an EF0 tornado, and we still had some impressive damage in the county. Give you one more example here. This was another house that did have homeowners insurance, but it did suffer. It was condemned. It did have to be demolished and rebuilt because there was just so much structural damage to the roof line and the front of the house from these large trees coming down. But in the end, within later that day, the tornado was confirmed in Montgomery County. The National Weather Service was able to go right out, establish a rating of a tornado. It was a weak tornado at EF0, which on the Fertitta scale, which is how meteorologists rank tornadoes, was pretty weak, only 75 miles per hour. But it was on the ground for not 17 miles, but actually 21 miles. And it was about 150 yards wide, so it's wider than your football stadium. But the good thing that I want to take away from this is there were no fatalities, there were no injuries. We were able to work to keep the human side of things, the human damage, to a very minimum. Like I said, it's a continuous process. When you're done with this disaster, you put the data away, you need to analyze it for historical risk. You need to work on continuing education and training because technology always changes. Research with nonprofit centers, with like-minded professionals. We join professional organizations. We present our data at conferences. Data, you should have added there. There's updates and changes. Software versions change. Programming languages change. New applications come across from technology. And for those of you who may say, this is kind of interesting, I wonder if there's anything coming up that maybe I could attend. There's two professional groups that are out there. One of them is the American Association of Geographers. Their annual meeting will be in Chicago, Illinois next January. But for those of you who may be a student and may want to look for something a little more local, you can, for December 8th and 9th in Baltimore, you can come to the Mid-Atlantic Users Conference for ESRI, which is the industry standard commercial software. And they also have a global users conference, which is the second week of July every year in San Diego, California. It's a huge conference that focuses on everything from public safety to mining to commercial enterprises. And this is just an example of the global conference last year. It's really a playground for GIS folks. If you're in meteorology, it's basically the AMS meeting, just maybe on a slightly larger scale or a very similar scale, but it's just a really fun time to promote research and collaborative enterprise within our society. So like I said, just to wrap things up, I know I've talked for quite a while and maybe a couple questions out there. So I want to show, we've demonstrated that GIS is certainly a very powerful tool. It's applicable to many situations, in this case, emergency management. That's readily available. There's freeware that anybody can download and start to play with. There's commercial software that if you want to do some very powerful high-end analysis. It's also very flexible. You can use it from damage assessment to hazard mitigation to mining to just recreation for sport fishing if you're using a GPS unit. It works for you. So if there's any questions at this time, I'd be real happy to take them. I think we have one here. One of them is, Matt, do you think that your training in GIS was an instrumental part of getting positions in emergency management? And I will say yes. Dr. Dr. H always preaches in his classes that, rightfully so, that emergency managers wear multiple hats. GIS was a big sector and me being able to successfully land a job with emergency management and be upwardly mobile. But it also helps me. It's one of many things that I do. I also do public safety technology. I also do emergency planning. But GIS can be integrated with all that. So when you can go in a job interview and say, yes, I have experience through an internship, or I have experience through a volunteer organization working with GIS, I know how to work this, I can provide an example of how it benefits your organization from a policy or a financial standpoint, it will put you heads and shoulders above the crowd and will help you on your quest to land employment and build your career. So.
Matt, I have a question for you, too.
Sure, go ahead.
I noticed you were talking about some of the new software and some of the freeware available out there for using GIS. Where do you think this stands on making this useful and presentable in a lower-end public use? I know, just as an example, a lot of the hydrological offices have been putting out these flood maps where they're using GIS data, and they're able to use a sliding scale and show, okay, if we're expecting it to flood to this level, you can slide the scale up to 20 feet or 30 feet, and you can see where things are flooding. And that does seem to have a good use for the public to be able to see, hey, is my house covered? Do you see this just ever increasing?
You know, I do. One of the things about GIS at first was that it was not used for emergency planning. It was used for mapping the planning of cities, for urban planning. But the problem at first was that it was a one-trick pony. GIS was really a very limited scope. So as we can continue to have more opportunity for the public and to use this, for other agencies to use this, and like you said, floodplain mapping for emergency management or what have you, the visibility for the industry gets out there. There's more of a desire. There's more people saying, hey, this is something that's really cool. There's a use for it. We need to continue to develop this so we can use this or leverage this in as many ways as possible. So absolutely. And of course, with the millennials starting to take over, we're a very technologically minded group of people. So we're always looking for a way that we can build an app for that, or we can make this easily consumable. And so absolutely, it's definitely going to be improving and expanding in that area.
Yeah, I just think it would be unique to be able to have some type of software where you could set it up at your house and just basically be able to have, whether it's internet software or an internet website, you can keep your house on there and then eventually be able to put what's the closest river, if there's a fire in my neighborhood, that kind of stuff that would show fire hydrants, all the different things that could be hazards and ways to mitigate those hazards around someone's house using this data. I think would be an amazing thing for people to look at. I'm sure insurance companies would do it first, but at home being able to plan what your biggest hazards are based on some of this data.
You're absolutely correct. And one of the one prohibiting factor is always the startup cost and the startup buy-in.
Sure.
I'm sure people are familiar with the site that's GoFundMe.com. I'm sure if you were to search on there right now, there's probably a couple of applications similar to what you have just described. I do know that some of the insurance industries use this. State Farm uses this for calculating some of their rates. If you live within certain areas, I know if you're near a nuclear power plant or if you're in an area out west that's very high fire risk, they look at the number of wildfires that have been in your area versus the construction type of your home, and that can help to kind of calculate your rates. So it's already starting. But I think within the next probably 10 to 15 years, you'll probably see an application like you just described come out.
That's pretty unique.
Yeah. Any other questions?
All right. I think that's it. We appreciate you talking to us, Matt. Again, we're going to go ahead and put this up on YouTube for everyone to be able to see. If you don't have anything else, I'm going to stop the recording, and thanks again for taking some time out of your day to help us out here.
No problem. If anybody has follow-up questions to me, I should have put my email address on, but if you guys just want to contact Jeff or the CDRE, they have my contact information on file, and we'll just go from there. I'll be happy to answer your questions. So thank you very much, guys.